This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan. It is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, which is a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Be sure to join our Patreon and write a review. We have links in the show notes to make it easy to do all of that. Really helps so we can continue having these great conversations like the one we're having today with Gidi Grinstein. Gidi Grinstein is founder and president of Reut Group, a nonprofit organization that creates and scales innovative models that tackle critical challenges facing the state of Israel, Israeli society, and the Jewish world. He's also founder and president of Tikkun Olam Makers, a global movement of communities that creates and disseminates affordable solutions to neglected challenges of people living with disabilities, the elderly, and the poor. Gidi has been involved in public policy and political affairs in Israel for many years, including leading the Israeli team in designing the Birthright Israel Program, which my kids are familiar with, my brother's kids are familiar with. Gidi served as the secretary of the Israeli delegation to peace negotiations with the PLO under Prime Minister Ehud Barak from 1999 through 2001, participating in the 2000 Camp David Summit. Gidi is also the author of Flexigidity, which is definitely next on my list that I have to read. Flexigidity, the Invisible Hand of Jewish Adaptability. And last year, he co-authored the book Insights, Peacemaking in the Oslo Process, 30 Years and Counting, which soon after its release, the world changed. So Gidi, it's so good to be with you today. Mashallah, my new friend. How are you?
Corey, thank you very much for having me. It's really great to be on your show.
You bet. So Gidi, I shared a bit about you have a very impressive professional and diplomatic background, but I've also heard you talk about different points in your life that were formative, like turning points in your life as a Jew and your connection to Israel. I was hoping you could share some of those important moments with us.
So, again, thank you for having me on your show. I grew up in Israel and within what is called the classical Zionist narrative. This is a narrative that sees Israel as the epitome, as the realization of the aspiration of Jews for the right of self-determination. It sort of expects all world Jews to aspire to come to Israel. It looks down. It is sometimes condescending with regard to Jewish life outside of Israel. So there is this way of thinking which we call the negation of the diaspora, meaning life in Israel is superior to life outside of Israel, and all Jews should aspire to come to Israel. This is not just a religious outlook, it's also a national outlook. Meanwhile, in 1994, I was an officer in the Navy. I was assigned to a program that sent me to America, and in the United States of America, actually in Los Angeles, in Simi Valley, at a place called BCI, Brandeis Collegiate Institute. I met young adults, Americans, who totally did not fit the model that that I came to know, which is Jews who are they were Jews who were comfortable with their life in America. They were proud American Jews. They were proud of their communities. They wanted to visit Israel, but they had no intention of moving to Israel. And that kind of exposure to the American Jewish life, to American Judaism, initially in LA and then in other places, really changed my perspective. And you could say that I came to America as an Israeli, and I went back to Israel as a person, as a Jew, not as religiously observant, but as a person who has a much broader conception of what the Jewish people is. And effectively, it really affected my hierarchy of values and a hierarchy of loyalties. When I came to America, Israel was first, everything else was second. When I went back to Israel, it was the Jewish people first. And my understanding was that the mission of Israel is to serve the continued and significant existence of the Jewish people, which is something that I learned from a very important teacher by the name of Avram Infeld. So again, the mission of Israel is to serve the well-being and the long-term security of the Jewish people. This is what we in Israel are about. We created a sovereignty. It's not just about ourselves in Israel. It's also about world Jews.
Yeah, yeah. Now I'm curious, you have did I read correctly? You have 5 kids?
5 kids, 3 from marriage and
Oh,
2. I mean, I'm the second husband. So
oh,
my wife
okay.
had 3 boys for first marriage. I married in, and then we had 2 kids together. We view all of them as obviously our children, not
Right.
just not her kids, our kids. It's a situation of
Yeah,
5 our kids.
right.
So I'm very proud of that.
That's great. That's
But I
great.
took a dive into to the deep end of the pool, meaning I moved from being a secular person in Tel Aviv to married plus 3 in a religious family.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I bring up your kids because I'm curious how your kids, what their worldview is like, and if you share some similarities in terms of Israel first versus Jewish people, and then understanding the differences between that order of priorities and how you see the world.
So first of all, this is a conversation that is a little bit more sophisticated and nuanced in terms of political values and ideology. And I have to say, like, frankly, a lot of my kids, most of them don't think about that or these issues. They are Israelis. They live in Israel. Obviously, they're very passionate about world juries. All of them lived in Los Angeles for 1 year, so they had the experience of life outside of Israel. But basically, in their mindset, they're Israelis.
Mm,
They don't give a lot of thought to what is the mission of the state of Israel or the mission of the Jewish people. These are things that are not really present in their lives. They are committed, generally speaking, both to Israel and to world Jews.
mm,
They have it. They don't have the kind of nuance that I have as someone that has actually dedicated much of his adult life since my mid 20s until now. It's almost 30 years to dealing with these issues, to actually asking what should be the relationship between the state of Israel that was established to be the nation state of the Jewish people and diaspora Jews. Israel is extremely unique in this situation. There are other countries around the world that have diasporas. And in some cases, these diasporas include tens of millions of people, maybe more than 100 million if you look at the case of India. But there's no such equivalent case where for the Jewish people, you have 4 overarching narratives. One is that we're a nation. All Jews are a nation that is connected to a specific place on the face of this earth, which is the land of Israel. This is really a narrative about exile and return. It's about sovereignty and ownership and control over the land or part of it. So this is the story of nationhood. At the same time, we're a people. I mean, this is the story of peoplehood. We have a shared legacy. We have a shared destiny. This is a story about all Jews being some sort of a family or a tribe that it has mutual commitment to each other that transcends religious differences, political differences, ideological differences. All of these things are secondary to the fact that we are committed to each other. So there's the story of peoplehood. We're also a religious group that collectively and individually have a relationship with God, and we're also a group that has a mission to humanity, to better the world, to serve the family of nations. Now, what is so interesting is that we're a religious group, but only 20 or 30%, maybe 15% of Jews throughout history were really religious and observant. It may have gone up to 40% at some point, but in no point in history, all Jews were religious. So and that's how, while many other groups around the world thinks of us about us as a religion. You ask most Americans, what is the relevant other to a Jew? They will say a Christian and a Muslim, meaning they view us as a religion. Whereas, for example, the United Nations, when they decided on the establishment of the State of Israel, the partition decision, spoke about a Jewish state and an Arab state. So for the United Nations in 1947, Jews were like Arabs, not like Christians and Muslims, right? So you're seeing all these distinctions being played out all the time between regarding this identity, the collective identity of the Jewish people. And my argument in my book, Flexigidity, is actually we are all four at the same time.
right.
So some people view us as a religion, and some Jews will define themselves through their religion. Others view us as a people, and there are Jews who view themselves primarily as part of the Jewish people. Same thing about a nation. Some around the world, they view us through the prism of nationhood, and there are Jews, especially in Israel, who view themselves exclusively through this prism of nationality. And there are others who believe that we are here to serve humanity. And this comes to the narrative of Tikkun Olam,
Tikkun Olam,
making the world a better place. This is sort of a more modern day manifestation of this idea, but it has been forever part of our mission. Forever, I mean, since the days of Abraham.
I was also curious about one part of your personal journey. I think you considered yourself, or maybe still do consider yourself, a secular Jew. But and tell me if I'm wrong about that. But you also talked about, at a certain point, you decided to start observing the Jewish holidays, in particular the fast days. Could you tell me about that decision making and the reasoning behind that?
Corey, where did you dig that up? That's interesting. Nobody ever asked me. I've been on many podcasts. Nobody asked about that point.
That's my job, man.
Yes. So basically, when you look at the Jewish calendar, there's 5 fasts. There are national fasts. They commemorate key events in our history. The day of the breach of the walls of Jerusalem, on the 17th day of the month of Tammuz. Tisha B'Av, when Jerusalem was destroyed twice, and many other calamities happened to the Jewish people. Gimel Tishrei, this is the 3rd day of the month of Tishrei, right after Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the Jewish year, which is effectively next week. And when we fast for the killing, the assassination of a leader by the name of Gedaliah, that was basically led to the exile of the Jews from their land. And then we have Yud Bet Tevet, the 10th of Tevet, which is when we believe that Moses died, and his grave is unknown. So we commemorate all those that died who don't have a grave, including millions of people in the Holocaust, and so on. So these are national events. And I realized that as a person who really believed in the nationhood of the Jewish people, I cannot let these dates go unnoticed. And there are many ways to pay respect to a day that actually commemorates a central event in the history of our people. And I could be very creative about how to do that. But really, our tradition offers us one basic manifestation, which is to fast, to acknowledge that this day is different. It's different in the sense that it commemorates a very sad moment in our history. And part of this sadness expression of this sadness is to actually deprive oneself of the pleasure of food and water for a day. So I wasn't creative enough to think about all these sophisticated ways of, eternalizing in my life and of these moments. So I just said, I'll fast. There is one fasting day which is different, which is Yom Kippur. And Yom Kippur is a deeply religious day. And because I am a secular Jew, I don't live a life of faith, but I am a very national Jew. I believe in Jewish peoplehood. Actually, Yom Kippur was the last fast that I took upon myself. For years, I would fast the 5 national fasts, but it wasn't important for me to fast in Yom Kippur. It's only later in life that I actually also began to do that. Initially, again, just as a kind of an expression of peoplehood. I said, if all of my people is fasting, or most of my people are fasting on Yom Kippur, I should do that too. It's not that difficult. And it was just a kind of a not eating experience. Yeah. Later in life, I began to appreciate the tremendous human value of Yom Kippur and the message that it carries to the individual. And then the fasting on Yom Kippur became very meaningful to me. But again, not as a religious person, but as a person that actually appreciates the cycle of the Jewish year, that in which in every holiday, there is a deeply meaningful message to the individual. In the case of Yom Kippur, the message is, and I learned this from Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, who says that in Yom Kippur, we have the opportunity to take control of our fate. The Greek philosophy believed that a person is basically fate. Fate is destiny. You cannot escape your fate. This is why we have the Greek tragedies. All these, Greeks who are trying to escape their fate, they're maneuvering, they're changing their lives, they're fighting their fate, but eventually their fate meets them, meaning character is fate. Judaism carries a different message, and that is that with enough work and intentionality, we can change our character, we can change our fate. And that is a huge message of Yom Kippur, and I so believe in it today, is that today when I go to synagogue, not today, it's been years now, when I go to synagogue on Yom Kippur, the whole question of whether I believe in God or not believe in God, that becomes really secondary to the profound meaning of the day and the message to me as an individual. That is, if I focus, if I have the intention, I can change fundamental things in my life.
Before we move on, I wanted to tell you about something else that's important. Money. Specifically your money. In all seriousness, I wanted to tell you about my advisor and my friend, George Meza. George runs Meza Wealth Management. And with George, it's not just about money. It's about helping us manage our present and plan for our future. And unlike a lot of other firms out there, George and I actually have a relationship. He knows me, he knows my family, and I know his wonderful family. I also know his firm and the incredible team he's put together, from his chief investment officer to some of the other great people in his office, like Jessica, their head of operations, that are always there to help me and with all aspects of our portfolio. You see, the thing is, I got a lot going on. I guess we all got a lot going on, and I don't have the time to watch our investments all day, every day. And even if I did, I don't have the experience and expertise that George's team collectively has. So we get the entire Meza Wealth Management team, all their expertise and all their integrity. And again, it's based on George knowing me personally, knowing my goals, and even the kind of risk that's appropriate for me to take, which, by the way, could change from one season to the next. And they're on top of all of that. So if you want George Meza and Meza Wealth Management to be on your team, just visit their website, mezawealth.com. That's MEZA wealth.com, www.mezawealth.com. And that will also be in our show notes, so you can check that. And now, back to our show. Yeah. When you talk about observing the fast days, especially as one who feels a profound connection to is our nationhood and our peoplehood, I want to think about this more. But you're inspiring in me some thoughts about why I still really appreciate one of my favorite holidays of the year is Pesach, and because to this day we still observe Seder. And I remember as a little boy going to my grandfather's house in Brooklyn and reading from the very same Haggadahs that we read from today. My father leads, and it's a very joyful, even when we were at odds. My father and I had years where we had a very tense relationship, but we still connected on Pesach. And what it meant to me was the way the invitation to my bar mitzvah went, as my father and grandfather before me. And it's not just about the men, it's about the men and the women and our whole family, our whole mishpacha, that we were, by retelling the story in this sort of ritualistic way, but a ritualistic way that included our children. And now that I have my children at the table, and my children are maybe within a few years of having their children, and me remembering my by retelling the story of our people, we're also participating in the story of our people. Does that make sense?
This is so profound what you just said. So just last week in the Parsha of the week, we read that Moses is really at the final chapter of his life. At the age of 80, he accepted the role of leader. Age of 80, he accepts to become the leader of the Jewish people, to confront Pharaoh. He is actually an Egyptian prince who was pushed to the desert, and now he comes back to face Pharaoh, if we can imagine that, in the name of the Jewish people. And then he leads the Jewish people through 40 years of in the desert. He's now at the end of his life, and he's conveying to the Jewish people in the book of the Devarim, Deuteronomy, he's basically conveying to the Jewish people an eternal message about the covenant that has been created between the people and God. And he says there very clearly, he says, this covenant is not just between me and you, those who are present here. It's also with those who are not present here, meaning the future generations. That covenant that has been created between the Jewish people and God is an eternal covenant. And again, I don't, obviously, there are a lot of people who see this through religious prism. To me, this covenant is actually a commandment to always strive to be better individuals, but also a better community, a better society, and to serve humanity. That to me is the message that we carry forward. We always have to strive to be better, or communally, societally, obviously individually, but then in the service of humanity. So Pesach, if we look at Pesach, right, we spoke about the four narratives: nationhood, peoplehood, being a light unto the nations, and a religious community. All of these narratives are present in the Seder. When we sit down for the Seder, they're all there.
They're all there.
Pesach is the moment where we came together as a people. We turned from 12 tribes into a people. This is the moment where we celebrate our shared legacy and our shared destiny. This is also a story of nationhood. We left Egypt to return to the land of Israel. It's a story of repatriation of an entire group of people that was willing to cross the sea and cross the desert and wandered in the desert for 40 years before coming back to the land of Israel. This is the story of Pesach, the story of Exodus. It's also a story of being a light unto the nation. I mean, again, mentioning him the second time, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, he describes this clash between Moses and Pharaoh as a clash between monotheism and idolatry. The Egyptians believe in the notion that there is a person that is a demigod, meaning he's half person, half God. His name is Pharaoh, and you have all these magicians around him that they have all these superpowers. And Moses is standing there representing a group of slaves, and he's saying to Pharaoh, no, you're not. You are just like anybody else. This is the beginning of basic human rights, basic political rights. It all emanates from there. And then, of course, it's a very religious moment. We celebrate in Pesach the Exodus and eventually the covenant that was created between the people of Israel and God in Mount Sinai. So what I'm saying is all these four narratives are present around the table. These narratives are not some philosophical ideas in the back door of our bookshelves. On our bookshelves. They are concrete. You can read about them today in the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. All four of them are there in 1,100 words in the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. And they contain, those 1,100 words, these four narratives, very present right now. This is the building block, not just of our past, it's also of our future.
So ironically, when you talk about that story, the idea of the 12 tribes of the descendants of Israel becoming one nation and God's formation of a people, a one people, it occurred to me from reading Insights, your book from last year, from 2023, as you recap your involvement with negotiations that have been going on for decades in different moments and forms. A huge part of the difficulty in negotiating peace is managing all of the different factions of your own side, not just you, but your interlocutors on the Palestinian side, and especially the extremists. Am I on the right track there? Like, I don't know why that didn't occur to me, but like managing the chaos of your own, the different states and factions.
So, Corey, just to share with the audience, we're talking about the negotiations between 1999 and 2001.
Right.
So we're trying to reach a peace agreement. We used to call it the Framework Agreement on Permanent Status. This is like a kind of the political and diplomatic name for what you may call the peace treaty. And this agreement came after 6 years of a process called the Oslo process. So the Oslo process began in September 1993. It was supposed to lead to the resolution of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. So come the permanent status negotiations, I was the secretary of the Israeli delegation. I was the youngest and was junior member of the team, but nonetheless part of it. At the center of everything was happening, which I describe my experience
in the room where it happened,
in the room where the sausage is made.
Or where you had to give Barak, the prime minister, a
Heimlich maneuver. Listen, if there's one practical thing that all your listeners should take from this conversation is everybody needs to know how to Heimlich. In a split second, you can save someone's life. It happened to
Absolutely.
me 3 times, 2 times more since Camp David.
But
That
only one
I
prime minister, I'm
only
assuming.
one prime minister, but every life is the same. He's the prime
Yeah.
minister, but in terms of life, it's the same. A friend of ours in a restaurant, she eats salad and a piece of lettuce covers her, her throat,
Yeah.
and I had to Heimlich her in the restaurant.
Wow. My brother did
So
that for my Uncle Jerry. So I've seen it. I've seen it. And I learned it. I've never had to perform it myself, but I have learned it.
everybody should have,
Yeah.
please, listeners, do it. You may save your friend's life, your
Yeah.
family's life.
Yeah.
Anyhow, going back to
Yeah.
managing complex negotiations. So the Camp David is really defined as complex negotiations. There are many issues at stake. All these issues are intertwined. There are trade-offs that you need to make within each issue. For example, let's say on territory, there are trade-offs that you can make within the issue of territory, but there's also trade-off among the different issues. Okay, so it's really complex. There are many, many building blocks in the air that you need to bring together. Those of you that will take the time to read the book, you'll see that there is, we, meaning the Israeli side, we had in our draft agreement, there were close to 180 provisions. Many of these provisions had more than one point in them. So we're talking about hundreds of elements
Yeah.
that need to be synchronized in one agreement. So naturally, when you do that on our side, there are a lot of factions. People have different opinions. There are those who, even among those who support the agreement, there are a lot of priorities. People are prioritizing different issues. So when you're the chief negotiator, my boss, or me as the secretary of the delegation, you're actually orchestrating all these factions around you. And I'm not even talking about all those who even oppose the idea of an agreement with the Palestinians for a variety of reasons. And then the same process happens on the other side. Meaning on the other side are those who really support in principle reaching an agreement with Israel, and they're willing to do what they call a historical compromise to get there. And there are those that oppose the agreement. And in their case, there was also their leader, Yasser Arafat, that was really undetermined. Many people say objected to the idea of reaching a peace treaty with Israel. So, yes, it's a story. My book is about negotiating with the Palestinians and attempting to reach a peace treaty. But the book is also, if you generalize the experiences in the book, if you take them out of the specific Israeli-Palestinian experiences, it's really a book about complex political negotiations.
Yeah.
And it's probably relevant to many other cases in history.
Well, in reading some of your recent articles, I noticed that there's flexigidity. There's some things that probably go all the way back to 1996, which I wanted to ask you about. One of the things you refer to is in I think it was in spring of 1996, you recommended undertaking, as you called it, a comprehensive research strategy and policy planning exercise ahead of negotiations with the Palestinians on permanent status that would ultimately wouldn't begin for another 3 or 4 years. So first, you're a 25 or 26-year-old kid at that point.
26.
How were you able to get the ear of the people who would ultimately greenlight a project like that? But then how were you able to to craft such an important, comprehensive report?
So basically, the last section of my book is called A Note to Aspiring History Makers. And it's basically like a letter to the young me,
Yeah.
which was then 25, and you want to be part of a historical process. And how would you go about it? And I have to say, the right intuition. And my intuition was, if I want to be involved in something that is historically important for the state of Israel and the Jewish people, and I say again, also for the Jewish people outside of Israel, I have to get in the room. And I was willing to cut my salary in half. I was willing to let go of being in the cadet course of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is a very prestigious path for diplomats in Israel, to actually carry the bags, literally carry the bags of the team of people that created the Oslo Accords. And that's how I started. So I began by carrying the bags and taking notes in their meetings and doing all these things. I was a captain in the Navy. That was seemingly a demotion. But for me, it was my way of getting into the room where things were happening. So over time, I became increasingly helpful. I became the right hand of my bosses. And then at some point, I became indispensable to some of their things. And at that point, I actually had a seat at the table. To their credit, from day one, they wanted to hear what I had to say, especially since I had this military background. So they valued what I had to say, but I didn't know what I was talking about.
Yeah.
But a year and a half later, I was able to bring the capabilities of strategic thinking that I learned in the Navy together with the knowledge and the content of Israeli-Palestinian relations. At that point, I was able to see, that was after Prime Minister Netanyahu was elected for the first time, believe it or not, in May 1986. As I was able to see that if Prime Minister Netanyahu would advance the negotiations with the Palestinians, everybody would support him. By the way, it's the same situation like today. But if he doesn't, the next government that will come in, they will have to deal with the Palestinian issue. But unfortunately, the people in government, civil servants, cannot professionally prepare for negotiations with the Palestinians because all of these issues are radioactive politically. So if you're in government, if you're a civil servant, you just cannot touch these issues. You can't actually think through the refugee issue or the resolution of the issue of Palestinian refugees when the government formally denies that there is a problem. Okay? So that's when I saw this discrepancy between the imminent challenge on the one hand and the inability of the government to prepare for it for the other hand. And I said to my bosses, we were all part of a non-profit, non-governmental organization. I said to my bosses, this is our opportunity. It's also our responsibility to prepare because the moment is coming. And in that moment, we will need the knowledge and we have to prepare. So we began to assemble all these experts from across the Israeli political and professional spectrum to prepare for the negotiations. I could not have known at the time that this exercise will make me basically one of a handful, literally a handful, 3, 4, 5 individuals in Israel that were capable of coordinating the negotiation. So when Prime Minister Barak was elected in 1999, and he decided, as I had anticipated, to embark in negotiations with the Palestinians, and they needed to build a team, there were really very few people that they could have brought on board to coordinate the team, and I was one of them. And I was lucky to be one of them. And that's how I found myself in the Prime Minister's office.
So who were some of the experts? I'm imagining historians, economists.
So basically, the Camp David, the Oslo Accord that was signed in September 1993. It's also called the Declaration of Principles. It was signed in Oslo and then re-signed again on the South Lawn of the White House on September 13. It actually names the what we call the outstanding issues, meaning what are the issues that will be negotiated in the future? The issue of economics and security and borders and settlements and Jerusalem and refugees. It doesn't mention the word statehood, but it does refer to the political outcome of the Palestinian entity that will be created. So we just followed this list, and for every topic that was mentioned, we created a working group of experts. So among our experts, we had generals. Obviously, we had professors, we had economists, we had lawyers, we had people that specialized in taxation, but also in tax law, but also people that specialized in the international law. We had water experts because Israel and the Palestinians share water systems. And we had people who were experts in Jerusalem, who knew every street in Jerusalem.
Right.
And then, these expertise were just a starting point. We embarked on this huge learning curve. I remember at the time going on excursions in Jerusalem in places I really only knew existed from the map, right? All these Arab and Palestinian areas that very few Israeli Jews venture into. And here I was with my boss driving in his, Renault sedan. We're driving in these Palestinian areas where there's no Israelis and no Jews and no police and nobody to, just to see what it looks like.
Right.
So we understand the implications of drawing a border in one place or in another place, and so on. It was a fascinating period of of exponential learning. And in that respect, I was also very privileged because I was in my late 20s.
Mm-hmm.
I was 27, 28, 29. And because of my work, I got to sit in the room with the leading experts in Israel and some of the leading international experts that came in to support our work. So
Right.
it was really an exceptional, formative, personal, and professional experience.
So you pointed out that the way you put it, from Menachem Begin to Netanyahu, every prime minister wanted to achieve peace because it represents acceptance of Israel by the Arab world and a historic milestone in Zionism's century-long quest for legitimacy. So my hard question is, can there be peace as long as Netanyahu remains in power?
Well, I think that the current positions of the Netanyahu government are diametrically opposed to the idea of peace. Netanyahu wants this government, which is the sixth Netanyahu government, actually denies the reality that there is an indigenous Arab people in the land that is under the control of the State of Israel. It's black on white, it's not interpretation. And then they're also saying that they want to extend Israeli sovereignty to control these areas, obviously without pledging commitment to equal political and human rights. So there is absolutely no way that this is a government with this platform that could lead to peace with the Palestinians or with the Arab world. That being said, Netanyahu, in his record, in the past, have shown the capability of being pragmatic. And two most important cases is what is called the Bar Ilan speech in 2009, where he accepted, albeit with many conditions, the outcome of two nation states for two people. But much later, Netanyahu and his team co-authored with President Trump and his team the so-called Trump Plan for Peace and Prosperity. This is a plan that Netanyahu himself referred to as part of the deal of the century. And this is a plan, black on white. Your audience, your listeners that will take the time to read the Trump Plan for Peace and Prosperity, speaks about two nation states for two people, speaks about a Palestinian state that has control over nearly the equivalent of 86% of the what we call the West Bank, about an expansion of Gaza to the Negev as part of a territorial swap so that Gaza is bigger for the Gazan population. This is a document that Prime Minister Netanyahu endorsed in January 2020. Okay, so we are talking about less than 5 years ago. In the preamble for this document, it says that the precondition for implementing these agreements, these understandings, is that Hamas will be removed from Gaza. At the time, nobody believed it was possible. And Netanyahu's people said to their audience, they said, look, all these conditionalities that we put that will never happen, like removing Hamas from Gaza, this is your insurance policy. It basically means we signed yes, we agreed to a document which will never be implemented. But then guess what? History has interesting ways of unfolding.
Right.
And right now, Israel is moving close to eliminating the control of Hamas in Gaza, which means that the primary precondition for implementing the Trump Plan for Peace and Prosperity is actually being realized. So what I want to say is, because Netanyahu, in his conduct, in his history, he has this pragmatic element in him, your audience should not rule out the possibility that he could turn on his right-wing allies, far-right allies, and eventually kind of pivot to the center, acknowledge the possible outcome of a Palestinian state at some point in the future, what we now call the political horizon. That will allow him to have a normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia. It will also open the door for the UAE to deploy forces and in Gaza, begin the Gaza reconstruction, etc. So yes, in the current government, it is impossible. But in a different government, you could foresee Netanyahu moving in the direction of a peaceful resolution.
In a few places, I want to ask you about a central factor in these negotiations and in the frameworks. And I thought of it because you've mentioned it in interviews, you brought it up several places in your book. I thought of it as the Jedi mind trick of these negotiations. I was hoping you could explain why you believe that Palestinian statehood was the most significant issue in the framework agreement to Israel's long-term identity and national security.
Right, because I believe that the mission of the State of Israel, as I said earlier, is to serve the continued and significant existence of the Jewish people. In order for Israel to actually represent the Jewish people, we have to stay a democracy. Israel cannot be the embodiment of the aspirations of the Jewish people throughout history if it is not a democracy. Now, in order to be a democracy that is of a Jewish character, there has to be a very significant Jewish majority within the borders of the State of Israel. Meaning, in order to preserve the ethos of Israel as a Jewish and state, meaning a state that is Jewish because it's democratic. A lot of our critics around the world are saying, how can you be Jewish and democratic? It's contradiction in terms. And I'm saying it's not a contradiction in terms when the vast majority of the population is Jewish. We need to choose which day of rest are we going to have. Friday per the Muslims, Saturday per the Jews, or Sunday per the Christians. When 80% of the population is Jewish, it's just natural that the national day of rest will be Saturday. Okay, so what I'm saying is there's no contradiction between being Jewish and being democratic if there is a Jewish majority, which is why we have to end the control over the Palestinian population. And ending the control of the Palestinian population will only come into being, will only be realized if there is a Palestinian state that realizes the right of people to self-determination. So basically, a Palestinian state is essential for preserving the ethos of Israel. Now, people say this state will be a threat to Israel, an existential threat. And actually, in this point, I believe that the Palestinian state needs to come into being with an agreement with Israel, through an agreement with Israel that addresses Israel's security concerns. Now, some people say that this is a state with limited powers, a state with limited sovereignty. There are all these terms that are being used by President Trump, by President Bush, by President Clinton, by prime ministers in Israel, Prime Minister Barak, Prime Minister Olmert, even Prime Minister Netanyahu, when he spoke about a Palestinian state in the Trump plan. They're all referring to the same concept, which means, yes, a Palestinian state comes into being, but because it comes into being in a moment of an agreement with Israel, it already comes into being with some limited powers. And those powers and those limitations on the powers are designed to enhance the security of Israel. It is widely agreed, including by the Palestinian president Mahmoud Abbas, that Palestinian state should be demilitarized, especially after the events of October 7. We know that there has to be adequate security arrangements. And what has happened because of October 7 is that leading Arab countries now understand our concern. When we used to say, hey, we need to control the perimeter of the Palestinian state security-wise, the team that I negotiated, Prime Minister Barak, said we need to control the perimeter of the Palestinian side. Everybody said, oh, it's just another way of continuing the occupation. But now people understand. People understand that there has to be that control. Now, that control cannot be belligerent through imposition. It has to be agreed upon by the Palestinians. So you may ask, why would the Palestinians agree to ever agree to that? And the answer is, and we see it over and over again, that if Israel is not secure, the Palestinians are not safe.
Right, right.
When Israel is not secure, the Palestinians are at risk. When the Palestinians cause so much damage and killing in Israel on October 7, nearly 1,150 dead people, thousands of wounded, 360 seriously wounded, 251 abducted to Gaza. The result was a calamity in Gaza, an absolute humanitarian disaster.
Right.
Okay, so what we know from history, and also we know from the current case, is when Israel is safe and secure, the Palestinian state can be safe and secure. And that's why there is a mutual interest here.
So one of the most difficult issues that you brought up, and that's been brought up in every peace negotiation. And forgive me, I forgot the right term, but I'm thinking of it as the finality of grievances.
Finality of claims.
What
Finality of
what
claims.
final?
Finality of claims.
Right, right. And especially in this last year, from October 7th to what Palestinian citizens would say, the bombing of Gaza, and so many different events that have happened just this year. How how do you overcome that hurdle? How do you the finality of, what is it again? The finality
Finality of claims. So
claims.
basically, originally we thought about it more as a legal concept. We didn't understand, honestly speaking, our team, with all of our preparation and deliberation and the analysis and the best brains, we never understood how politically significant finality of claims is. So first of all, let me explain what is this demand of finality of claims. We said to the Palestinian side, look, you need to bring all of your claims from Israel to the negotiation table. We will negotiate them. We reach an agreement. Once we reach an agreement, you can only have one claim from Israel, which is to implement the agreement. What was our concern? Our concern was that we will have an agreement, we will ratify it in the Knesset, in our parliament, we will make the historical concessions, and then at some point in the future, the Palestinians will come forward and say, hey, there is this UN General Assembly Resolution 194. There is this Resolution 181. There is a Resolution, 242. And according to these international resolutions, there are still outstanding claims that we want to negotiate again, meaning what we call the permanent status agreement will only be a stepping stone for additional demands. So from the beginning of the negotiations, we said to the Palestinians, you have to come forward with everything. And we will negotiate all of your claims into one agreement, after which there's one demand to implement the agreement. Now, this sounds simple. It's basically what every negotiation, it's kind of a basic expectation in every negotiation. Both parties bring their claims and they're being resolved in an agreement. But in this case, what we could not appreciate is how unprepared and effectively incapable the Palestinians were in discussing and prioritizing their own claims. Because when we told to them, bring forward all your claims, they needed to decide, what do we want from Israel? Until then, it was very easy. Every person that had a claim from Israel could come forward and throw their claims. Everything go. But now we said, look, we need a list. Bring it all together. Bring it all to the table. And what that required of them is, first of all, to decide what they want from us, and then to prioritize these claims, because obviously they couldn't get everything they wanted. And because they had a very weak political system, they had no bureaucratic capability, they had barely no civil service to support them, etc. They actually were incapable of going through the internal process of prioritizing, of deciding what really matters for them. So the more we pushed for finality of claims, the pressure grew and grew internally. And I believe that this is, to a large degree, the reason for the implosion of the negotiations beginning on September 28th. So effectively, the serious negotiations begin in May until September for about 4 months. The highlight of that period is the Camp David summit from July 11 to July 25 at the Camp David retreat of the US president, then President Clinton. But then 2 months later, the negotiations implode. And I believe that the major reason for the implosion is the fact that there was so much pressure on their side coming from us. Finality of claims. Bring all your claims forward. You have to prioritize. We have to make a deal.
Yeah. Finality of claims. I can't imagine whether it's families of Palestinians who've lost their homes and lost their loved ones, Palestinian citizens, as well as people that my family knows, who lost their loved ones on October 7th. To have your government say, we need to put this to bed in order to arrive at peace. That's an impossible needle to thread, it seems like.
Well, that was a different period because relative to what we're seeing right now, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was quite benign. We had some clashes, of course, but in historical terms, in comparative terms, we didn't have a lot of dead and a lot of wounded. Also, remember that in the 1990s, you could still move between Israel and Palestine. A lot of Israelis met Palestinians. A lot of Palestinians met Israelis. So it wasn't that distant. And there were a lot of other reasons why we thought that we could negotiate with the Palestinians a peace treaty. On the Palestinian side, there was a very strong, politically strong, what you may call today peace camp. There were people who believed in a historical compromise with Israel. And my book with my co-author, Professor Aryeh Filalo, we tell their story and we share how much they were willing to risk to have peace with Israel. In many ways, if we kind of zoom out, they are the tragic figures of this story more than anybody else. Because if you are a member of the Palestinian peace camp in 2000, you were offered a state that covers 95 to 99% of the West Bank and all of Gaza. You were offered $40 billion to begin to resolve the refugee issue. You had an offer that included a Palestinian capital in the area of Jerusalem, some sort of control and administrative management of Temple Mount. You had so many things that were put on the table, and all that was needed was for Arafat and the leadership to agree to, which they didn't. 25 years later, look at the disaster and the calamity. So if you are a Palestinian who believed in peace in 2000, your heart must be bleeding. Now, right now, of course, we are in a totally different situation. October 7 was a savagery at a level that nobody had imagined ever in the political process. It was, I would say, 25, 50 times bigger than the biggest suicide bomb that we ever had in our history. Something like that, dozens of times bigger than any single event that we have seen. And of course, after that, when the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, went into Gaza to uproot Hamas, and Hamas is a threat for peace. Whenever we get close to peace, Hamas intervened with terror and ideology to undermine the peace process. It happened in the 90s, it happened in early 2000, it happened after the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002. Over and over again, Hamas, as a radical Islamic organization, mobilized to derail the peace process. So if any of your listeners are pro-peace, they should be against Hamas. And Hamas is fighting from within the Palestinian population, underneath the Palestinian population, placing the civilian population between its militants and terrorists and the IDF. It's a tragedy. Every civilian person lost there, a life lost there is a tragedy. And there's no but. So if we believe in peace, Hamas has to be removed. And paradoxically, I hope that we may be much closer to this moment, and that we may be very close to this moment. And that moment, when Hamas is removed, can actually open opportunities for peace that are very hard to imagine right now. I hope, and some recent polls indicate that the Palestinian population in Gaza no longer supports Hamas in its majority. There was a recent poll that I read that only 30% support Hamas. So meaning, just imagine, everybody imagine that after the disaster in Gaza, people are tired. They want peace.
Yeah.
They want to live in peace. They want to go back to a home. Now, will be 66% of the homes and the buildings in Gaza are destroyed. 66%. 2/3 of the population is displaced, which means people want a new home. They want a new neighborhood. They want to come down to see a nice road, a playground, a school. And then, and all of that is possible within a few years. If we pass this kind of threshold of recognizing that there will be a Palestinian state, the UAE coming in, deploying an international force with other groups, billions of dollars for the reconstruction of Gaza. This war, as bad as it looks, could be a turning point.
So I want to ask you where we go from here. You've already indicated that you do see a path forward, but I do need to ask you about U.S. domestic politics. What's been your reaction to you're based in New York still, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So what has been your reaction to the protests? We've seen it on many college campuses around the U.S. and the world, as well as the rise of anti-Semitism that we've seen, especially in this last year.
So I think that we have to um, try to understand the phenomena we're looking at. Some of the protests are critical of Israeli policies. I'm critical of Israeli policies. It's legitimate to be critical of policies of the Israeli government. Then at some point the line is being crossed, and what we're looking at is the delegitimization of Israel and anti-Semitism. And the delegitimization of Israel happens when Israel is being singled out, demonized, and delegitimized, when the very right of Israel to exist is being questioned. At that point, we're dealing with anti-Semitism.
Mm.
And that's a totally different phenomenon. But then when you move further on that spectrum, we have to understand, and I've been saying this publicly, and I think increasingly it's being revealed, that there has been extensive external intervention in this American dynamic. So the protests against the policies of the Israeli government are acceptable, ethically acceptable. Anti-Semitism, ethically unacceptable, but it's been a part of America for a long time, unfortunately. But then there is this other element where foreign forces, Russian, Chinese, Iranian,
right,
Qatari, intervene in American society, and that is a national security threat. This is dangerous because especially the Russians, but also the Chinese and the Iranians, they have been very good at stirring things up. I don't have a proof, but I do believe that there is a line that connects the dots between the protests against Israel on campus and the yellow vest protest in France that basically rattled French politics, and the protests that happened in Italy, and the rise of the far right in Austria just this week, a very significant political victory. There is a common thread there, and that common thread is it serves Moscow, and this is where there is a spectrum of events that may seem on the face of things as the same thing. Some of it is legitimate, some of it is ethically illegitimate, and some of it is a national security problem. And I really hope that the people in Washington are watching this, because for these interventions, this is a national security threat. This is like the intervention in American elections. This is an intervention in the mode of operation of American society, and that's very, very serious.
Right. That sounds like it's ripe for a whole other episode unto itself.
Yes, I'm not an expert on it, by the way, but I just see the systematic element of it. We're seeing Russians, for example, intervening in Israel.
Yeah.
Russians are inciting different groups that are radical groups in Israel to basically clash with each other. They're promoting Arab Israelis to rise up against the government. There are systematic Russian interventions in Israeli politics, and we're seeing it here. We're seeing it across the Western world. This is something really big. It's huge.
Yeah.
And unfortunately for the Jewish community, we find ourselves dealing with these protests where on some side of one area of this friction with the protest is a political debate, then it's an ethical debate, it's illegitimately anti-Semitic, and then there is this other thing where we are just a pawn in a global war for power between the United States and these other superpowers.
So I've heard hints that given what's happened over this last year, we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of October 7th. Do I sense a bit of hope? And if so, where do you see things going from here?
So it's very hard to be hopeful at the moment, but I do want to point out a few things. First of all, I'm speaking to those in your audience that believe in peace. I'm a person whose entire adult life has served the cause of peace and supported very significant compromises by Israel in order to reach peace. So from this perspective, I want to say the following. What we're seeing in Lebanon is potentially historic. Hezbollah is a bad actor.
Mm-hmm.
They're terrorists. They've killed Americans. They've killed Israelis. They've killed people over the world. Most of all, they've killed Sunni Syrians. And they are a representative of another evil government, which is in Iran. The fact that they're being beat up in Lebanon is not just Israeli success. It's a success for the entire Western world. And it creates an opportunity for Lebanon to finally, hopefully, come together as a country, relieved of the hold of Hezbollah, and creating a political system that can move forward. In the best of worlds, if I can, if I would have a magic wand to design the future, this war in Lebanon, and as you're recording this episode, the Israeli forces are moving into southern Lebanon after striking at the leadership of Hezbollah for the last 2 weeks. This war should end with a bilateral Israeli-Lebanese agreement that recognizes the mutual border, turns the border into a border that is bilaterally agreed and internationally recognized. No more territorial disputes between Israel and Lebanon. No more territorial claims between the two countries. Second is the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which means that only the Lebanese army can be close to the border. Hezbollah or any other militia cannot come down closer to the border than the Litani River. Those of your people in your audience can look at the map where it is. This is vital for the future of Lebanon. That happens, then we are actually moving into the ability to, perhaps kind of stabilize Syria. I do acknowledge that this may require an agreement with Iran. Why can we get an agreement with Iran now on better terms than anything before? Because for the first time in 25 years, they are on their back foot. It's the first major setback to the Iranian, what they call the Ring of Fire, the proxy system that they have built in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and so on. First major setback in 25 years. So in Lebanon, what has happened in the last 2 days creates opportunities. Nobody knows how we're going to unfold. It's a complex and dynamic system, but at least you can see the opportunity in Gaza. With regard to Gaza, sadly today, the positions of the Israeli government will not allow any positive progress. But the Israeli government is increasingly facing the challenges of governing Gaza and the tremendous diplomatic, economic, administrative consequences of that. And they are begging the Emiratis, they're begging international forces to come in. And everyone says, no, we're not coming in unless you guys recognize the political horizon that includes a Palestinian state. And we're not coming in unless you recognize that the Palestinian Authority and the PLO are the governing body of Gaza. We have to be invited by the Palestinians, because otherwise we, meaning the Emiratis, we may be seen by the Gazans as occupiers. We're not willing to do that. So they're pushing and pushing in this direction. And eventually, I think the Israeli government will have to agree, because the alternative, which is direct control of Israel in Gaza, is far worse. So it may not happen tomorrow or anytime very soon, but at some point, I believe that this war will lead to the reinstitution of the Oslo Accords in Gaza. I've written an extensive article. I don't want to bore your audience with all the details, but basically, reinstitution of the Oslo Accords in Gaza, and Emirati and Arab forces, international forces coming in, boots on the ground, beginning to reconstruct Gaza, and moving Gaza in the direction of what we call permanent status, meaning we will have an opportunity to begin to move from what we call day after to the political horizon. So this very brutal war that began with a horrendous event on our side and then continued with really, as we were fighting Hamas, very significant cost and casualties and destruction on the Palestinian side. Maybe that is the war that will lead to I don't want to say peace. I want to be very careful, but some sort of a peaceful coexistence in Gaza and perhaps also in the West Bank.
Mm. I will be sure to put a link to that article in Fathom that came out recently. Our mutual friend
Yes.
Agar Shamali sent me that was very helpful. Um, I before we wrap it up, I also wanted to ask you and hear more about Reut Group and Tikkun Olam makers.
So Reut is a think tank that I created in order to deal with challenges that are facing Israeli society, the Jewish world, and the Jewish people. What is unique about Reut is we use a very special methodology that identifies strategic disruptions. We create a vision, and then we go out to try to effectuate that vision. We've worked on Israel's international standing, on economic development in Israel, and also, as I said, on the relations between Israel and world Jewry. It's been a great, great ride with a tremendous group of people. Many of my team members went on to assume significant positions of leadership and authority and influence in Israel. So I'm very proud, not just of our work, but also of the tremendous team that we had. Our goal was always to give every member of the team a formative personal and professional experience that would serve them as they continue a lifelong journey of contribution. And many of them did. So I'm very proud of that. Out of Reut came this project called TOM, Tikkun Olam Makers. We mentioned the concept of Tikkun Olam. It's an ancient Jewish concept that calls upon basically every person to do what they can to make the world a better place. Tikkun Olam Makers is like an innovation arm for people who are vulnerable populations. Meaning we all know, it's well known, that 90% of innovation serves 10% of the population. It's by design. Every startup wants to succeed, so they want to sell to people who have money. So the bottom of the pyramid, the vulnerable populations, are structurally excluded from the innovation economy. And again, I'm not saying that there are no inventions that serve poor people. Obviously, there are. But when you think about in the bigger picture, you could say that they are marginalized. And in developing countries, meaning in poor areas in the world, more so even than developed countries like the United States. So you have 2 billion, 3 billion poor people around the world. And we're looking at them and we're saying, how can we, as an Israeli and Jewish project, how can we help them by creating solutions that will help them? When I say solutions, I'm talking about prosthesis, wheelchairs, devices for eating, drinking, mobility, participation in sports and music, all these things that many of your listeners may take for granted, some people cannot afford. So we develop these solutions. All of these solutions are open source and free. Your audience can go to www.tomglobal.org. You can download the design of the solutions and manufacture them locally. And that's happening all over the world. So our vision is to help millions of people by making this library of open source and free solutions available for anybody, anywhere. Our motto is, by the way, affordable and accessible for anyone, anywhere. So anybody can download and manufacture it locally. You only need basic skills of a junior in high school, basic tools, and basic materials to create all of our products. So that's the vision. The vision is to help millions of people through this project.
250 million from what I read.
Yes, 250 million, which makes us a moonshot project. And everybody says 250 million, it's crazy. It's a huge number. And I say, yes, it's crazy, of course. We may never get there. Most likely, we'll never serve 250 million. But when you think in terms of moonshot, if you engage with moonshot thinking, it really pushes you to build your organization to scale. Every element of the organization needs to be ready for scale, which means that you need to invest in the platform, in the process, in the playbook, so that other people can join your movement, and it can really grow exponentially. So we may never get to 250 million, but the number of 250 million inspires us to build a great organization.
That's very inspiring, and I'll be sure to put links to Reut and Tom Global, Tikkun Olam makers in the show notes as well. So how can we follow you, find more information about Reut? You already said Tikkun Olam makers, but say where we can find you online and all the great work that you're doing.
So basically, our website, tomglobal.org, has all of our work. I also have a personal website called gidigrinstein.net. People can, check it there. And there, I mean, I can give you a number of links. Maybe I'll do it over email, but basically,
Yeah.
there are a number of places.
Terrific. Yeah, we'll like I said, that'll be in the show notes. It'll be really easy to find the different activities that you're a part of and the organizations that you're leading. We covered a lot. There's still a lot more to cover. Is there anything important we haven't discussed that you'd like to add, or anything that you'd like to ask me?
So basically, first of all, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be with you, and I just want to acknowledge that we are taping this just before the Jewish New Year, which is basically beginning in Wednesday. And the Jewish New Year is an opportunity to kind of, first of all, obviously for self-reflection, but also to think about the kind of world that we want to see and the kind of world that we want to be a part of. And I hope that we've clearly, the last year has been a very difficult year. It's been a difficult year for Israelis. It's been a very difficult year for Jews. It's been a very difficult year for many other people. I don't want to be kind of self-centered in this kind of thinking. And hopefully the coming year will be a year of more stability, more security, more prosperity, and eventually moving toward peace for our entire region and the world.
Amen. Gidi, this was Toda Rabah. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to know more.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova. And I hope we get to do this again. Maybe see you in person when next time I'm in New York, or you're out in LA.
That. Thank you so much.
That'd be great.
I love LA.
And as always, if you dig what we're doing, remember to follow this show, write that review, and join the conversation on Patreon. It's patreon.com/politics and religion. Go check that out. Get some TPNR swag, the coffee mug, the tote bag, or what have you. Really excited about all of that. Now, go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.